In Unit 4, we'll be talking about how to analyze and evaluate an argument, which is an important skill that you'll need to master in order to complete English 101. This is the skill that you'll be demonstrating in the final paper of this course. So questions that you should be able to answer after this unit include what is an argument, what are the different types of evidence, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of those, and what is the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning. So these are the terms that you'll need to know, and we're going to begin by discussing, first of all, what is analysis. So you've been doing analysis all along. Analysis means to break an argument down into its component parts. So we pick apart the essay and we say, what is the audience's, or who is the audience? What is the purpose? What is the main idea? What are the pieces of evidence? So when in our final paper, you're going to be evaluating those pieces once we've identified them. In evaluation, we take a look at those pieces a little bit more closely and we try to determine whether or not they are effective. So we say, is the author's claim reasonable? Is the evidence believable, consistent, sufficient, and reliable? Is the author's credibility, does it hold up? Is the author biased or not? Does the organizational pattern that they've used make sense for this kind of material? So we are going to look at all of those pieces and then we're going to evaluate them. And by evaluating all of the pieces, we will eventually be able to evaluate the whole of the argument itself to determine whether or not it's a strong argument or a weak argument. So not every statement is an argument. An argument specifically is a claim that an author is putting forth and supporting with some kind of evidence. So it's fine to just make a statement and say, I don't like MCU's treatment of women. That's not an argument. I'm not trying to convince anyone else of that. But if I were to say, Avengers Endgame was terrible, it did a poor job of representing its female characters, then clearly I am putting forth a claim and I am trying to convince other people by also providing some evidence for my statement. So that's the difference between just a statement and an argument. So you need to be able to identify in an essay what is the argument that the author is trying to make. And then once you've done that, then it's important to identify the evidence that the author is using to support the claim. So there are different types of evidence that we're going to discuss: facts and statistics, studies, testimony, expert opinion, analogies, and hypotheticals. And each type of evidence has its own advantages and disadvantages. Not quite what just happened. I guess there's two sides of that. So first of all, facts. Facts are generally regarded as being very strong pieces of evidence because they can be proven. However, it is important to recognize that sometimes facts can just be made up or reported inaccurately. So it's important to determine author and source credibility in order to be able to believe the facts that the author is giving. So I've given an example of each one of these types of evidence in case you need to kind of see what that looks like. But this is an example here that says, additionally, your vehicle's other safety features, particularly airbags, won't work as effectively if you're not buckled up. In fact, the force of an airbag can seriously injure or even kill you if you're not wearing a seatbelt. So this is like the National Highway and Transportation Safety Advisory. That's the source of this. So I would trust this fact. Right? That the force of an airbag can seriously injure or even kill you if you're not wearing a seatbelt. I'm not sure that I would trust this fact if it were just posted on a blog somewhere without a reference. So you have to be careful about facts and make sure that they are facts indeed. Statistics are another piece of evidence that people typically find very convincing. However, as with every piece of evidence, you have to be careful because statistics can be easily manipulated. It's very easy for somebody who's presenting statistics to cherry pick data. They only pick the data that represents what they're trying to say, or they may misrepresent the data on a chart so that it looks a certain way, even though it's not been plotted correctly. This is an example of a statistic here with approximately 24% of children 6 to 17 years of age participating in the recommended 60 minutes. The United States earned a D- in overall physical activity. So that's a statistic. That is a percentage. And it's actually, this one is fairly credible because it does tell you what the percentage was, who they were, like what was the sample that they were evaluating, what exactly they were evaluating for. All of those things are important to look for when you're trying to determine the significance of statistics. This is an example of poor representation of statistics. If you look at the chart on the right-hand side, if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, you'll see this was actually presented in a congressional hearing in a bid to defund Planned Parenthood. And you can see that this looks terrible for Planned Parenthood. It looks like cancer screening and prevention services is going way down, while at the same time abortions is going right up. Do you see anything wrong with these numbers, however? If you look at that chart, it affects you emotionally, but if you look carefully at the numbers, you might find that there's no axis that shows the measurements, right? So we can't see like whether or not these are in perspective. It's also true that the numbers aren't represented accurately in relation to one another. For example, on the right-hand side, abortions, the 327,000 number is actually much less than 935,000, which is the cancer screening number. So this is completely misrepresented, and there's a lot of information that is left out of this chart. So this is the accurate chart of those same numbers. And you can see on this chart that while, yes, cancer screening and prevention did drop over that period of time, if you look at the axis of the numbers and the way that they're represented accurately, you'll see that abortions really barely increased at all, and also that abortions are the smallest percentage of all of the services that Planned Parenthood offers. So, not that I'm trying to push Planned Parenthood, but this is an example of how numbers can be misrepresented. So you have to be careful when looking at statistics to make sure that they are being presented carefully. Studies and research may very well be the strongest type of evidence overall because scientific research is typically, very rigid. It's very structured and controlled. So you do have to kind of make sure that the study have been done appropriately. You want to make sure that the organization that has presented the study is doing that fairly and following the accepted guidelines. For example, the study that came out many years ago about the link between autism and vaccines has been found over and over again to not be replicable. They aren't able to replicate those results, which devalues and delegitimizes the original study. And yet people still use that study all the time in order to promote the anti-vax movement. So you do have to be careful a little bit with studies just to make sure that they are following appropriate scientific protocols. So this is an example of what a study would look like in an argument if you were trying to identify this as a piece of evidence. Testimonies can be very powerful pieces of evidence because we really react to hearing somebody tell their story. However, you do have to be careful because, a testimony is really just one person's story. It's an opinion and it can't really be proven. So you have to be able to weigh the value of the testimony. How many people are saying this? How credible is this person? Is this a typical testimony? And does it contradict or does it support the other evidence, the facts and the statistics and research studies that have also been shown about this topic? So here's an example right here about what a testimony might look like in an essay if you were trying to pick that out and identify it. And then I do have a question here too at the bottom for just to think about that, Amazon product reviews are a great example of how testimony can be very powerful and valuable when we're trying to make a decision. But you also have to weigh that, because if your doctor's prescribed you a particular kind of medicine, you certainly wouldn't want to stop taking it if you hear, one person saying, oh, I had a bad experience with that medicine, don't take it. So testimony can kind of be, it can be both credible and not credible, effective and not effective, depending on the other circumstances. An expert opinion is essentially, it's like an opinion, like a testimony, but it comes from an expert in the field, somebody who has education and credibility in that field. So their experience typically makes their opinion more valid or more valuable in an argument. It is, however, true that experts are still humans and people believe different things. So you do have to be careful and check your experts and find out what their personal reputation is and their credibility and whether they're biased or objective. I'm running out of time. All right, so analogies are a little bit tricky, I think, sometimes. An analogy is basically a comparison. And one way that we use analogies to serve as evidence is in order to make a point a little bit easier to understand or relate to. However, sometimes analogies just are not accurate comparisons, so you do have to be careful for that. The example is, actually, cars exemplify the public health approach we need to apply to guns. We don't ban cars, but we do require driver's licenses, seat belts, airbags, padded dashboards, safety glass, and collapsible steering columns. And we've reduced the auto fatality rate by 95%. So in this analogy, the author is talking about cars, but they want you to apply those ideas to the idea of gun reform. So this is an example of how we can use an analogy as a piece of evidence in an argument. A hypothetical is when we are presenting a case that's imaginary or that takes a current situation and runs it out into the future to see what its implications are. It definitely can help to make a situation more relatable, but it's important to remember that hypotheticals are not real situations. They are based on possibilities, and there's always some uncertainty with an outcome. So not all hypotheticals are guaranteed. So there's an example here of what a hypothetical looks like, and we don't necessarily have to have the word hypothetical, so don't feel like you have to look for that, but you can look for the word if, right? If this were to happen, then blah, blah, blah. So that's a hypothetical. That is taking a situation and moving it out into the future. And sometimes that can be very effective. It's a very good way of having the audience think into the future about what the implications of an argument may be. But again, you just have to be careful because it is based on possibility. What isn't evidence in an article? You have to be careful not to pick these things out as evidence. First of all, counter evidence is when an author provides evidence that opposes their topic. Typically, they do that because they want to say, okay, I know some of you are going to argue that blah, blah, blah. However, this is my real evidence, right? So you be careful about that counter evidence. Assumptions that the author is making, those are not pieces of evidence. Those are assumptions. You have to be able to identify those. That's what Unit 3 was about. And fallacies, which is the next part of Unit 4 that we're going to talk about. Fallacies are essentially flaws in the logic. All right, the last bit is inductive versus deductive, and I have less than a minute. Okay, basically, most arguments are based on these two types of logic. Inductive reasoning is bottom-up processing, where we start with all of the evidence or the clues or the data, and we build up to come to a conclusion. Whereas deductive reasoning goes the opposite. It's top-down processing. We already know the end result or the conclusion, and then we start to build a case based on the clues and the evidence that we can find to support the conclusion that we already know. So that's the difference between inductive and deductive logic. There's a lot of information out there about that if you want to explore it a little bit more. Hopefully this covers the basics of analysis and evaluation of arguments.